there are loads of lawyers coming onto the market, loads of people going to law school, but actually there's a real shortage of legal expertise in the places where it's often most needed. So the opportunity here, I think, is for artificial intelligence to augment that legal expertise so that it can get to all the places where it's needed.
Today on LawNext, a conversation with Emily Fogus, CEO of Luminance, one of the fastest growing AI companies in the legal industry. This is Bob Ambrogi, and you're listening to LawNext, the podcast that features the innovators and entrepreneurs who are driving what's next in law. We'll get to today's interview in just a moment. But first, let's hear from the sponsors who generously support LawNext. And now, on to this week's interview. Emily Fogus, thank you for joining me today.
No problem.
And you're joining us today from London, as I understand it. You must spend a lot of time on the road.
I spend a huge amount of time on the road. It's very nice to be in London this week, spending some time with the team. If you can picture it. So we have offices overlooking Trafalgar Square, and it's a beautiful sunny day for once. So yes, it's very nice.
Very nice. So Luminance was launched in September 2016. Which means it's not yet 3 years old. And some of the numbers numbers about the company are pretty startling given that time period. I mean, you've raised $23 million. You've achieved a valuation of $100 million. According to the information on your website, you're now used by more than 150 organizations on 6 continents. And you've won any number of awards, including most recently a Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation category. So for a 2.5-year-old startup, these are some pretty impressive numbers. To what do you attribute this level of growth?
I think there are 3 things in descending order of importance, really. The first and most important one is the technology. So this is a real breakthrough in the way that computers read and understand legal language. And without that, none of this would have been possible. But I think the other side of that is the fact that the legal profession was really ready for a change. And I think, that we were very lucky in that we came along at this precise moment. I think the timing's been amazing. And then the third part of it really, I guess, is just our people. Just that, we've managed to recruit the right kind of entrepreneurial spirits who, see possibilities rather than barriers, and think, well, why wouldn't we work with a law firm in Nairobi as one of our first 10 customers? And I think without that attitude, we wouldn't have made the strides that we've made.
You came to the company without, as far as I can tell, having directly worked in the legal industry. You'd certainly been involved in legal matters, M&As in particular. How is it that you came to be involved with this company?
I think like all of these things, it was sort of equal parts luck and judgment. So I think 90% of the job of finding the right opportunity for you is knowing what that needs to look like. And I'd got to a point where I'd been working for a long time on M&A deals where I was doing the integration work. So in the methodology that I developed for doing that with big acquisitive companies was really, thinking from the ground up. If this was a new company, how would we design it? And then building the business model out from there. So having done that on a loop for sort of 20 years, I really got to the point where I felt like I'd like to do something from the ground up and then run the business for myself rather than build a whole new business and hand it over to somebody else to run it. And having articulated that to myself, of course, then you start talking to people. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine who said, well, what do you want to do next? I said, well, I'd really like to run a startup. And it just happened that she had met the Invoke partners a couple of days before and talked about this exciting new investment they were making into this machine for lawyers to read and understand legal language for M&A. So she thought of me and put me in touch. And then that was that. But, really, it was, 50% knowing what it was that I wanted and 50% that opportunity coming along at the right moment.
You said that you attribute part of the success to the idea that lawyers were, or the legal profession anyway, was ready for a change. maybe so. And yet 3 years ago, AI was still, and I would maintain today for a lot of lawyers, AI is still a little bit of a foreign concept, something they don't understand. So what were the challenges that you faced initially in trying to get the word out to the legal community?
It really depends which part of the world you're talking about. And I think one of the things that's really distinguished our path to this point is the fact that we had to go all the way around the world in order to be successful in our own backyard. And I think a big part of that was down to the fact that London law firms in particular had burned a lot of resources on technology that wasn't ready. So they'd spent time with, sort of early AI solutions, which actually, took a lot of resources and didn't give them the results they were expecting. And so they had, what I think of as being kind of, AI fatigue by the time we came along. Whereas when you go to more of a greenfield site like Singapore or Australia or the Nordic regions, because our technology is language agnostic, we were able to go and tackle those markets when nobody else has been able to. So that really gave us the opportunity to go and work with those firms who were looking at this as a kind of fresh, new idea, rather than something that they'd already spent a lot of time and money on and failed with previously. So actually proving our concept with, if you look at our first customers, it's hilarious. First a Norwegian firm, then a French firm, then a Dutch firm. These are not companies who previously had access to anything else because we're the only technology that works in any language.
So I guess that comes back to the technology again, because you were not, certainly when you launched, you were not the only company providing AI document review for the legal profession. How did you, was it based on the technology alone that you were able to distinguish yourself from those other companies? Have you distinguished yourself, or is this, I'm kind of asking two questions here, but is this a matter of a rising tide lifts all ships? Have these other companies kind of all benefited from the adoption of AI, or do you think that yours has had a unique advantage?
So it's interesting. I think it took me a long time to understand this because obviously we don't see the other products in the same way. But what I've come to realize is that the technology that was previously being billed as AI document review was really doing a couple of things. It was either teams of consultants going and building bespoke systems to analyze, for specific issues and specific sets of documents, in which case what you had was very, very high cost of setup for something that would probably work very well, but then no flexibility when the next problem comes along and you've got to start all over again. So there was a whole category of products on the market that were working like that. And then the other category of products, which were probably more serious competitors for us in the early days, were doing really what I would call automatic clause classification and extraction, which means you've got some rules in the system that if you put some documents in, those systems will identify some predetermined things that are in there and spit them out into a spreadsheet for the lawyers to look at. And I think when you look at what Luminance does, first of all, we hate the idea that you would take the lawyer away from the actual contract and the content of those contracts, and that you would give them a spreadsheet full of clauses to review rather than the real kind of context of what's actually going on in an organization. So Luminance never does that. And secondly, clause classification is one of the many, many things that Luminance does in order to get the lawyers as close as possible to that set of contracts, to deepen their understanding and their insight into a set of contracts. It's like 1/50th of the functionality that you get with Luminance, and yet those other products in the market just do that. And I think because we didn't build Luminance looking at other products. We built Luminance from the first principles of, right, this is what technology is capable of now. Technology is now capable of understanding language in a way that it never has before. What can we do with that? We never looked at those other products when we were building it. In fact, we only became aware of them after we'd launched, when people started to come along and say, oh, hey, so you've built a competitor to so-and-so. We weren't aware of that at all because we'd really started from first principles of, what can the technology do and what is the need for the profession.
So you did not look at the competitive landscape before you launched Luminance?
No. I mean, Well, I might say, not before. So I suppose in the build-up, so if I kind of think about the timeframes on that. So when I arrived at Luminance, the only people working for Luminance were lawyers and technologists. And there was one lawyer and like 2 or 3 technologists at that point. And none of them had done anything like that. They were just looking at, what can we do? When I arrived, I wanted to put some timeframes around launch. And as part of that process, I said, we should really kind of have a look around and see what else there is on the market. And we started to come across these names and try and understand what they did. But that was long after the whole product was built and working and in beta with Slaughter and May. And, nothing that we saw caused us to change anything about the product at all.
I alluded earlier to your lack of direct experience in the legal sector. Not to say you weren't familiar with the sector in some way, but do you think your lack of direct experience in the legal sector worked as an advantage or disadvantage to you?
You mean like a sort of healthy naivety about the ability of the legal profession to change anything?
Exactly.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. I mean, I think we hire a lot of lawyers at Luminance because they tend to be really good analytical thinkers. They tend to be very intellectually curious. They understand the ins and outs of a law firm and how it works. I don't have that direct experience. There are lots of people at Luminance who do. But I think the other thing that really characterizes the legal profession is, a really kind of, risk-averse nature. So actually, for me, I think being surrounded by those kind of people is very good. But also, I'm somebody who will say, well, let's try it. I bet we can do that. Let's see what happens. And I think you need a balance of those kind of personalities in any organization, right? So I think me not being a lawyer is probably quite important in that context.
Something else that was interesting to me about your leadership, looking at your webpage, you are a woman CEO in an industry that tends to be male-dominated in the executive ranks. But according to your website, of the 6 executives listed on your site, 5 of them are women. Was that by design?
Well, no. And I was on a panel the other day at one of our law firm customers put on a kind of gender diversity event and put me on the panel and started to talk about unconscious bias in your hiring. And I was thinking, I can't really talk about this because I tend to hire giraffes. I'm 6 foot tall. And when you look at, you can't tell from those photos, right? But quite a few of those women that are on the leadership team are also characterized by being like, tall. So there's something going on there. But we have now addressed that imbalance within Luminance. We are able now to hire guys as well. No, it definitely wasn't a deliberate thing. It's something that I recognize and I'm working on it.
Well, it's certainly not a bad thing.
It would be if you turned it around the other way. But yes,
well, I suppose. I mean, do you think that having a greater number of women than men in your management at all affects the way you approach the market or deal with your customers? I mean, is there any gender impact in the way you do business?
Yeah. I don't know. I think probably one of the things that it does is, and these are all kind of unintended consequences because you never see a pattern until after it's happened. So it wasn't until I sat on that panel that I started to think, hey, maybe I've got a problem with unconscious bias. But I think probably one of the things that it does is, we're very visible because everyone's very aware at the moment that if you run a conference and you want speakers, you don't want to have a load of identical looking middle-aged men up on the stage speaking. So we probably get more opportunities to talk about what we do as a result. I would say there's probably a little bit of that goes on to an extent. Other than that, I don't think it makes any difference to the way that we run the business particularly. I think that's probably the only thing. I'm looking at Jess to see if she can think of anything else, but yeah, I think probably that's the only thing. I mean, my husband is a magazine editor, and he actually refused to chair a panel the other day because the entire panel was male. Which he's in a completely unrelated industry, but it did make me think. We probably benefit from that because we've got a good stock of credible, interesting people that we can put out there on stage to talk about Luminance, who would also fulfill the gender criteria.
Yes, there is certainly backlash against the so-called manels these days. and many
Manals.
people are, yeah.
I've never
many
heard
people
manals
are-
before. That's funny.
All male panels, and I've been on a few of those, I will say. So just for anybody listening to this podcast who maybe this is their first introduction to Luminance, tell us what you do.
Sure. So Luminance is a technology platform that reads and understands human language and then learns from the interaction with lawyers to get smarter at that. And it learns in a much more human way than anything else that's come before. So what that means is that you don't need to set the system up. You don't need to train the system. It means that it works in any language equally, because all that matters is the lawyer who's using the technology speaks that language and understands that area of law, and then the machine will respond in that context. So we started out with a product that was for M&A due diligence for relatively random reasons, but those reasons were really, it was an area that I understood very well. And so I could talk about it. It's an area that people are interested in, and it's an area where junior lawyers are at risk of burnout, and managing partners in law firms are very worried about the impact on the profession of just the volume of document review that has to go on and what that does to their associates when they first join. So when we first launched the platform, Steve Cook, who's the managing partner of Slaughter and May, said to me, I look at the trainees coming into the firm, they're the brightest of the best out of the best universities. And actually then we give them this tedious, repetitive work to do, and they're either going to burn out or they're going to become tedious, repetitive people. And I don't want that for the future of the firm. So M&A due diligence was a good place to start for that reason, but actually you can apply Luminance in many different situations. So we now have a version of the platform which is designed specifically for real estate, so for analysing large quantities of property leases where you need an understanding of the concept of time as well as the language in a contract. We also have a version of Luminance which is for litigation, arbitration and disputes, so more like e-discovery, where you're looking at communications between people rather than contracts and analysing the language in those. And more recently, we've launched a version of Luminance which is for in-house lawyers when they're looking at negotiating contracts. So a new contract comes in, and you can understand immediately with Luminance whether the terms in that contract are something that you have agreed to previously, or whether they're similar to something you've agreed to previously, or whether there's something in there that you would never agree to, and Luminance can highlight that like that for you. So the crucial thing there is with all of those products, you, the lawyer, are still reviewing the document. You still have your eyes on the document, but Luminance is helping you and guiding you towards the most important information first. And it's doing that through starting out by analysing the patterns in the language and finding patterns across large quantities of documentation. And then when the lawyer ascribes a meaning to that pattern, that understanding flows through the whole system. So it's really unique in that it means that the lawyer is actually closer to and more intimate with a document than they would be with any other method. But they're still working at, normally the very first time they use Luminance, they're working 100% faster. And then as Luminance learns what they're looking for, that accelerates.
My sense is that among larger, more, I don't know if I want to say more sophisticated firms, perhaps, there's a greater understanding and use of artificial intelligence, and that as you kind of go down, at least here in the United States, as you kind of go down the scale in terms of size of firms, there is less familiarity with AI. And I know that when I talk to, I still encounter a number of lawyers who have this idea in their mind that AI is something that is going to put them out of work. From what I hear you saying, that's not at all the goal.
No, definitely not. We never want a lawyer to tell their client, Luminance says this or Luminance says that. This is very much, the analogy I always use is this is very much like your accountant using Excel, right? Excel is not your accountant. Excel does not mean you don't need an accountant. But your accountant not using Excel would be a bad idea. Deciding that they should just use pen and paper and that would be better. So Luminance is very similar in that it's going to make much better use of the expertise that you have and the insight that you have. It's going to really accelerate that insight and give you more insight, but it's not replacing you. And I think when you look at the legal landscape, it's not that the world needs less lawyers. There are loads of lawyers coming onto the market, loads of people going to law school, but actually there's a real shortage of legal expertise in the places where it's often most needed. So the opportunity here, I think, is for artificial intelligence to augment that legal expertise so that it can get to all the places where it's needed.
We'll get back to my interview in just a moment, but first, let's take a break to hear from the sponsors who generously support LawNext. And now back to Emily Fogus, CEO of Luminance. So how has this area, in the 3 years, less than 3 years that you've been doing this at Luminance, what changes have you seen in lawyers' use and understanding and adoption of AI?
So it was interesting what you said earlier about in the US, the understanding of artificial intelligence being greater at the top of the kind of AmLaw 100. Our experience elsewhere in the world has actually been sort of the other way around, which is that where artificial intelligence is needed most is not in the big kind of wealthy firms in London and New York. It's in those markets like the Nordic region where there is an undersupply of new lawyers coming onto the market. So actually, you've got a manpower issue. Or in Australia, where the norm amongst those law firms now is to work to a fixed price and it's highly competitive. So actually improving your margins as a firm and making the most of your expertise is really important. So we're actually seeing a much greater understanding of the importance of AI, how to use AI, how to get the best out of this new technology in those markets historically. It's changed in the last year. So in the last year, I think that the big firms have been adopting far more readily and seeing the point of adopting the technology much more. I think in the early days, the big firms were sort of ticking the innovation box and saying, yes, we are using artificial intelligence because they wanted to tell their clients that they're doing everything they can to give them the best possible service. But actually doing something in anger and actually really making the most of the technology to actually see results has really only happened in the last year to 18 months, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, it may here be more of a marketing issue as well, because I think a lot of the companies have marketed themselves more to that larger firm and corporate legal market, maybe because that's where the money is, and less to the smaller firm market. Is that something you do as well? I mean, you just one of the major developments for you this year was a new partnership you announced with EY Law that's going to make your product available across the EY legal advisory offices
the network
throughout the globe, which is pretty significant. Are you also trying to go, diversify those who are using your product?
Well, I think the reason that Luminance is able to provide services to smaller law firms is just that there is not that cost of setup anymore. So I think those other products that you're talking about, they are very expensive. And the reason they're very expensive is because there's a huge amount of setup and configuration that has to go on before you get any value out of the technology. Whereas what we've built is something that works out of the box, that you get value out of on day one. You don't need to set it up. You don't need to train it. You always hear those providers talking about, you have to train the machine or it's not going to work. Yep. And that's not the case with Luminance, because it's learning as you do the work. So we are accessible to firms that those technologies were not accessible to, is one point. And I think, we're needed by those firms more than we are by the large firms. But, as in the inevitable consequence of that is obviously a lot of those kind of boutique firms, for example, the boutique firms across Europe are very strongly partnered with and associated with the top 10 firms in the world, and working very closely with them. So then you end up with a situation that I had a couple of weeks ago where I was at the IBA M&A conference in New York. And a partner from one of the firms came up to me and said, right, I need a pilot. And I said, that's great. How did you hear about Luminance? And he said, well, I was working on a deal and the other side had Luminance, and those guys were impossible to negotiate with. They were working so fast. They were finding so many issues. We just couldn't keep up. So I need a pilot. I said, do you want a demo? No, I don't need a demo. Just give me the And I think, that sort of network effect has kicked in for us now, where you've got the kind of top tier European firms, Australian firms, Singaporean firms, all using Luminance because they need to and because they can. And then the firms on the other side, who will be the big firms, looking at that and thinking, how come we can't keep up with these guys?
An extension of this issue is that AI has not been as is not widely used at this point. Again, I'm basing this more on my perception here in the U.S., but is not widely used in addressing issues of access to justice among lower income individuals. It's not as widely used in the criminal justice sector. Do you see that changing at any point?
I think it absolutely should. I've approached a number of firms actually about the possibility of us doing some pro bono work in that area to prove the concept, to introduce the idea that there are huge advantages to be had there. I mean, we talk to a lot of firms about the fact that, they can't get the funding to do the investigations that are needed for some of the kind of public inquiries in the UK. And so actually technology ought to enable their lawyers who are doing that work pro bono to make more of their time, and actually get that work done more rigorously and more efficiently using the technology. So yeah, we're hoping that someone will take us up on that soon.
I know we're running very short on time here, but I wanted to ask you where you see this going. How is AI going to change the legal profession? How is it going to evolve within the legal profession over, say, the next 5 years?
I think it's going to become really normal. I think, we've gone through a curve quite a rapid curve in the last few years from, this is robots taking our jobs. I used to get heckled at conferences. I used to stand up and give presentations and there would be lawyers in the audience saying, this is going to take our jobs. No, it's not. That was how everyone felt. No one feels like that anymore. Everyone recognizes this is augmenting what you do. It's making you better. I think, the last kind of bastion there is, how do we protect the billable hour for as long as possible? I think, once everyone accepts that actually the value of what you do as a lawyer is not measured in time, at that point, this becomes a completely normal way of working.
So you feel that we've reached a tipping point with respect to AI and legal?
Oh, yeah. Oh, totally. Yes, very much so. I mean, you look at the adoption of the technology with our customers and the rate at which that's accelerating. Absolutely. It's becoming completely normal. And I think as those stories are shared, not just from firm to firm, as I mentioned earlier in New York, but within the firms, so where you've got the very big firms, the big global ones where, one practice area in one country will say, hey, look what we did. And somebody else will want to do the same thing. So that's happening kind of exponentially now.
Again, quickly, how does that then change the competitive landscape for law firms going forward?
I think it changes the competitive landscape in one way, in that your success is no longer determined by your firepower. So it's the quality of your legal advice, your position in your client's mind as the trusted advisor, your ability to really have an intimate understanding of your client's business and really, give them the best quality of advice that differentiates you, rather than how many thousands of paralegals you have sitting in warehouses processing documents in bulk. So I think that takes us back to a world where, the lawyer is the trusted advisor. It's somebody that, you look to whenever you make a big decision, because they have the best ability to help you with that, rather than the kind of, this is how many hours of work we can spend on something in order to crunch through huge amounts of data. So I think there's a kind of, there's a sort of macro implication there. I think, the smaller firms, the boutique firms, the kind of firms that we see, for example, in Italy, we've got a really great customer, Portolano Cavallo, who they were partners in some of the big Italian law firms who decided to go off and set up their own firm. Which is really unusual thing to do in Italy. And using technology, they can punch way above their weight there and be really kind of, operating on the world stage in a very short number of years, because it's no longer about how big you are. It's just about how good you are.
Yep. And what about for Luminance over the next 5 years? How do you see the company evolving, changing, growing?
One of the big things that's happening in the next few months is we're ramping up our hiring in the US. So we had our Series B funding earlier this year, as you know, and we've made a significant hire into our New York office, and we'll be building out the team there. We already have a team there, but we'll be building that out significantly over the next 6 months. We have launched our in-house product, which means that the addressable market from Luminance goes from every law firm in the world to every company in the world, because every company has lawyers pretty much. And that's a product that's appropriate whether you've got one lawyer or 6,000 lawyers. Any organization can make use of that. So we're going to need a lot more people in order to attack that larger addressable market. We're going to just keep growing. We've really only just got started.
Emily, a lot of legal tech startups listening to this program. Wonder if you have any advice for them as a CEO. Any advice for how to be successful as a CEO of a legal tech startup?
I think get back to first principles. Focus on the fundamentals. What are lawyers for? Why do we have lawyers? Why are they important? Why do people want to be lawyers? And how are you supporting that? And don't look around you at the sort of legacy technology that's around that seems to be doing very well at the moment, but will inevitably be superseded by you.
Very good. Well, Emily, I appreciate very much your taking the time out of your day from London to be a guest on our program.
That's no problem. It was my pleasure.
It's been a pleasure to speak with you. And thanks again to Emily Fogus, CEO of Luminance, for being with us today on LawNext. Thanks also to the sponsor who keeps this show running, MyCase, with thousands of customers. It's a trusted practice management solution helping lawyers across the country run organized, efficient, and successful law firms. Try it for free today at mycase.com. And thanks to Ben Ambrogi for producing and editing the show. That's it for this week. This is Bob Ambrogi.